Okay. Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for coming today. On behalf of the Mexican Studies Group and the Bildner Center, welcome to today's panel. Could you please turn off your cell phone, please? Thank you. Yes, today's panel, Mexico and Asia, patterns of cultural and economic exchange. Dear friends and colleagues, students, thank you so much for coming. Your presence means a lot to us, and I would like to thank the Bildner Center for hosting this event. Over the last 6 years, Mauricio Font, the director of the center, has been very supportive. Thanks to him, we organized several events and seminars in our persistent effort to promote Mexican studies and scholarship. I would like to thank the research assistants, their rigorous work. Without their efforts and hard work, these kind of events would not take place. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you so much. Last semester, we presented the book Technology and Culture in 20th Century Mexico, where the collaborators examined how technology not only transformed the economy, but also the culture of society and the daily lives of the Mexican people. The second panel was focused on the wealth of information that can be drawn from the Mexican digital libraries. And today, we are going to talk about the relationship between Mexico and Asia, and as you will see, this relationship has lasted for many centuries. So our first presenter today, I don't know if you all received a copy of this, just the bibliographies of the presenters are here. So our first presenter today is Professor Miguel Arisa. He will be talking about the Manila Galleon. Professor Arisa teaches art history at the Technical Career Institute in New York. He lectures on topics related to colonial Spanish art and is interested in the intersection of different cultures as they meet together through cultural or political exchanges. Thank you, Dr. Arisa. Please come in.
Thank you, Araceli, and thank you to the Bildner Center for providing this venue for these discussions. I'm particularly happy that we have literature and art history at the same time. My topic is Asia in Mexico in the 17th century. Spain's and Portugal's acquisitions of vast overseas empires in the 16th century ushered in an era of global exchange that truly revolutionized the economic, social, cultural, and artistic spheres of Asia, Africa, and the Americas, not to mention Europe itself. Thus, the Iberian Peninsula's entry onto the world's political sphere after centuries of internecine wars catapulted newly formed Portugal and Spain into a network that spanned not only the Atlantic Ocean, but the Pacific and Indian Oceans as well. Between 1580 and 1640, Spain and Portugal would become one monarchy under the Habsburgs, and the exploration of new trade routes led unexpectedly to a larger, hitherto unknown world to the Europeans. By 1556, when Charles V abdicated and Philip II, the second Habsburg monarch, ascended the Spanish throne, Madrid had become the capital of the empire, and Seville the port of entry for the wealth of the Americas. More importantly, the viceroyalties of New Spain and Peru, created in 1535 and 1542 respectively, would become sources of unimaginable economic exploitation, with the Philippines, named after Philip II, the outermost post in these far-flung colonial territories. Spanish merchant ships laden with goods to and from the four corners of the world would become the conduit for the newly established global economy and the convergence of ideas and artistic styles. Imports from Asia, arriving in the harbor of Acapulco, in New Spain introduced objects from centuries-old traditions in China, Japan, and India, as well as elsewhere in Asia. This is actually a picture of Manila from the lid of a 17th century chest. They enriched the households of the viceroyalty and they were copied and imitated in New Spain, thus producing a new hybrid version of those Asian arts. Furniture such as desks inlaid with mother of pearl, folding screens or biombos, Chinese blue and white ceramics, boxes and chests. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Like 9 something.
Yes.
Can the lights be lowered a little?
They're being lowered.
Yes, we need lower now. Yes.
Okay. They're too low, I can't read. So.
Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, of course. Jonathan, can we put the lights up because Professor Sorry. Is it there?
So, biombos and white ceramics, boxes and chests, Indian and Chinese textiles, porcelains, and ivory sculptures were some of the items that were brought to Mexico City by the Manila galleon in its way to Europe. A large number of them, however, remain in the New World, some becoming models for the industries. Known as in Spanish now the China, between 1565 and 1815, this yearly trading fleet provided an unrelenting passage of goods from Asia to Europe. By way of the New World, creating an economic activity of unparalleled proportions, as has been well documented by William Shirt's splendid book, The Manila Galleon, which was written in 1939, and nothing better has been written ever since. By the longest and most dangerous mercantile route in history, according to the scholar Torres-Rodríguez, it is a perfect example of the widespread economic mantle the countries of the Iberian Peninsula managed to spread during the first 2 centuries after the conquest of the Americas. In the catalog to an exhibition that took place in 2000 in Seville and in Mexico City and Acapulco later, about the Manila galleon trade and its consequences, the curators summarize this cultural and commercial exchange very clearly in terms of the benefits that and gain derived by the Spanish crown. And I quote, the axis, Sevilla, Veracruz, Mexico, Acapulco, Manila, served as a permanent way for a communication that would include men and women, precious metals and exotic products, and finally intellectual, religious, and artistic currents throughout the entire early modern era. Important entries in Antonio de Robles' diary, a great source of 17th century information on the events of the day, such as obituaries and ecclesiastical feasts and so on, were always declaring when the Manila galleon was arriving, when it was leaving, and called to prayers when that happened. The Europeans traveling to the New World were astonished to see the myriad objects that could be found in the markets of these, for them, far-flung foreign lands. And for example, this is a view of the, today the Zócalo, by one of the most important 17th century painters, Cristóbal de Villalpando, showing us the market, the so-called Parian market, which was also the name of the market in Manila. Such is the case of the Italian traveler Giovanni Francesco Gemelli Carreri, whose voyage to the New Spain records in the very first chapter the advantages for European traders selling their wares in the West Indies. And I'm quoting from Caredi. It is very convenient to sell in the West Indies all the silk brocades that have been brought from China and the fabrics, white and colored, from the coast of Coromandel and Bengal, and even more, the porcelains and the fans, also from China. The former because they're things that are very too fragile to take to Europe, and the latter because they're good presses. I'm going to read from perhaps one of the most important 17th century exaltations or glorifications of Mexico City from Bernardo de Balbuena. I have a translation here in English. What wealth, city, land like no other, fuller of treasure and beauty than fish and sand in the deep sea. Who can encounter to your wealth? You know, I have a trouble here. Can I have a little bit more light?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Who can account for your wealth? Who can account the number of your famous merchants? More truth than faith than subtleties. Who will say of your rich fleets the assets that come and go laden if you are the sum total of them? In you, their greatness abbreviated, you supply them with fine gold and silver, and they supply you with more precious things. In you, Spain and China are one, Italy and Japan, and finally a whole world in trade and discipline. In you, the treasure of the Orient are better enjoyed. In you, the cream of all that the Orient breeds among its light. These verses from Bernardo de Balbuena's erudite poem Grandeza Mexicana from 1604 sums up the Spaniard's appraisal of Mexico City, the city he loves and the city he places at the epicenter of the world culture at the beginning of the 17th century. The references to the wealth of goods and treasuries in gold and silver as well as in other intangibles indicates not only Baroque New Spain's exuberant riches, but the myriad sources from which the colony has been nurtured. No doubt Balbuena exalts the Spanish Empire that so cogently has given this land, and I quote, order, concert, propriety, harmony, and peace of the city's religious and civil mechanisms, of its physical layouts, to quote from Stephanie Merriam's The Spectacular City. En ti se junta España con la China, Balbuena's verse explains, and indeed it was the idea of New Spain as a kind of exuberant melting pot between the East and the West that produced enconchado paintings, folding screens, Puebla ceramics, etc. Balbuena was not the only writer in Mexico aware of the country's far-reaching embrace of overseas cultures. The most renowned Mexican work engaged in the Manila Galleon is perhaps El Periquillo Sarmiento by José Joaquín Fernández de Lizardi, whose main character straddles episodes on both sides of the Pacific. In one instance, Periquillo alludes to the cargo in his ship. Ya se sabe que la nao de China a su regreso de Acapulco no lleva más carga que víveres y plata. It is the galleon that transports the picaresque character to Manila, where he will gain access to a small fortune. And I quote, pues mi jefe, como me amaba y tenía dinero, me franqueaba lo que yo pedía para comprar varias anquetas en el año que daba por su medio a algunos comerciantes para que me las vendiesen en Acapulco. Ya se sabe que los efectos de China, y más en aquellos tiempos de la sombra de las cajas que llaman de permiso, dejaban de utilidad de 100% y tal vez hasta más. In many ways, Periquillo's experience in Asia reveals the inefficient nature of Mexico's productivity. Asia was more influential in colonial Latin America than in Europe. This relationship was established by Columbus himself, who, as we all know, thought that he had arrived at the outskirts of Japan. The notion begun in the 16th century by the Jesuit José de Acosta in Peru that Amerindians had migrated through the Bering Strait centuries earlier was beginning to hold sway. Miguel López de Legazpi, the Spanish conquistador, arrived in the Philippines from New Spain in 1565 with the sole interest of colonizing the archipelago. A year later, the San Pablo galleon, commanded by Fray Andrés de Urdaneta, made its first trip to New Spain, having found a practicable route across the Pacific and initiating the trans-Pacific trade in earnest. When inventories in the households of the Viceroyalty's elite are inspected, many of the items can be associated with this trade. The Manila galleon left the port of Acapulco laden with American silver and other raw materials and natural products, and returned months later with manufactured goods, primarily porcelains from China, ivory statues of saints from Fujian and Manila, folding screens from Mexico and from Macau and Japan, spices, pearls, and furniture, mainly from Southeast Asia, and above all, fine silk cloth, including, before 1692, pieces of Chinese imperial court costume, sent to the Americas after the dynasty that commissioned them had fallen. However, it is chiefly due to the Jesuit missions to Japan that a more permanent and continuous relationship was established between the European colonialists and the Asian countries. Even though they were not the first, once the Jesuits arrived in Japan in 1549, closer ties ushered a century-long of social, cultural, and artistic exchanges. After St. Francis Xavier's conversion efforts took hold and the art academies were founded, of up to like 40 artists each, apprentices in their workshops. These religious missions were only part of the grander trade relationships that ensued beginning in the 16th century. Namban art, the European art introduced into Japan by Catholic missionaries around the middle of the 16th century and subsequently copied by the Japanese, flourished, but eventually ceased to be produced after the missionaries were expelled from Japan in the 17th century. And this is actually a Namban screen that you can actually see at the Metropolitan Museum today, because there's a special exhibition of Edo art. And the picture's a little blurred because there's a mirror in front of it, I mean a glass in front of it. The word Namban means southern barbarians, a term with ambiguous connotations, but which nevertheless refers to the hybrid art resulting from such an encounter. Some of the Japanese artists who had converted and were the subject of persecution were able to flee and establish themselves in Spanish Manila, or even across the Pacific to settle in the New World. The Nau de China brought not only goods, but migrants and slave labor as well. Tomás Calvo, a Mexican scholar, makes the case for a large community of Japanese migrants in Guadalajara in the 17th century. A series of mural paintings in the Cathedral of Cuernavaca gives away the presence in Mexico of Japanese people. The murals in question represent the Franciscan martyrs of Nagasaki. Elena Isabel Estrada Herrero has studied the cult and its manifestations. I'm not going to go too much into the story. You can ask me later. In 1587, the shogun Hideyoshi had ended the so-called Chinese century and banned Christianity and commenced their persecution. Hideyoshi was responsible for the crucifixion in Nagasaki of 9 missionaries as well as 17 Japanese converts, known today as the 26 martyrs of Nagasaki. The murals in the Cathedral of Cuernavaca show multiple figures, including St. Philip of Jesus, narrating their vicissitudes and final crucifixion. Other representations of the event were also documented in the Franciscan Church of Tepeaca, the convent of Sinacantepec, the Agustinian cloister of Zacualpan, and so on. Of the martyrs, the one who had the greatest resonance was San Felipe de Jesus, the first criollo to be elevated to sainthood. He is usually represented pierced with 3 lances, we see here in the Metropolitan Cathedral's sculpture. An enconchado showing the Jesuit founder, St. Francis Xavier, embarking for Asia, signed by Juan Gonzalez, depicts a scene based on a print by Cornelius Blumart, Netherlandish graphic designer, basically, and painter. St. Francis Xavier, the Jesuit follower of St. Ignatius of Loyola, spent several years in Goa, Japan, and finally made his way to China, where he died evangelizing the newly converted Christians. A private devotional panel, judging from the inscription to a Doña Ana Rodríguez from Madrid, depicts St. Francis Xavier in front of a galleon, attentively contemplating a map of China, displayed by a personification of Europe, flanked by personifications of the continents of Asia, Africa, and America. This panel, in itself, embodies the confluence of cultures in New Spain, perhaps like no other. Not only is the creation of the painting perhaps the work of Asian immigrants in Mexico who had brought the enconchado technique to New Spain and turned to Dutch engravings for inspiration, but the scene rendered is also one where European or colonialists are imposing their worldview on the other continents of the planet, personified by figures in different shades of brown and exotic dress. The piece was made for a Spaniard, Doña Ana Rodríguez, who had left her country to establish herself in Mexico and who was the sister of the first Marquis of Villa Mediana and daughter of Pascual Rodríguez de Mediavilla y Rodríguez del Corral, who had come to Spain in 1673 with the Viceroy Pedro Niño de Portugal, Duke of Veragua. Furthermore, the figure portraying Africa holds a battle axe, the figure portraying Asia a lance or a spear, and the one portraying America a bow. This contrasts with the Europeans who are holding a huge, well-defined map of the East, a rather accurate depiction of that part of the world for that time. The disparity in attributes where the Europeans appeared civilized and the others as awaiting the civilizing effects are evident. The obvious message delivered by such an image of Eurocentric propaganda could not have escaped either the Dutch engraver, the González family of painters, or the recipient of the panel, Doña Ana, who would have embraced such ideological content. Besides Guadalajara, Mexico City, Cuernavaca, and Puebla also had large numbers of Asian immigrants. By 1624, Japanese residents were already recorded in Ahuacatlan, in Nayarit, in Mexico's west coast. That some Asian artists took up residence in the Mexican capital and established themselves in workshops where they were able to impart their techniques to whomever was interested in learning about exotic art forms is still not corroborated by any specific names. Some migrants, eager to blend with the rest of the population, may have adopted Spanish names, even though some scholars have asserted that González was a favorite name adopted by these migrants. It is not so easily corroborated. It is difficult today to identify Asian migrants since once they Hispanized their names, their origin became practically impossible to ascertain. The difficulty in tracing the migrants is also the result of the Asians' seamless interaction with the Europeans. A case in point is Juan Anton of the Japanese nation, who appears in a document of 1631 as the godfather of the child of a freed black slave in Guadalajara. According to Edward Slack, a scholar in 17th century demographics, the cities of Puebla, Veracruz, and Mexico City had high densities of Chinos. This scholar's research has led to the revelation of frictions between Asian migrants, workers in Mexico, and the criollos or mestizos that plied for the same work. And the word Chino also was used for anyone, whether he was Chino or Japanese or anything else. As that appears aptly points, there's a number of Chinese figures in the panel transferred of the image and inauguration of the Sanctuary of the Virgin of Guadalupe by Manuel Arellano from about 1709. Recognized by their native garb and hairstyle, they're avidly looking over a balcony at the proceedings. You can see on the left side there. You see them a silhouette against that white wall. In a scene that purports to display the melting pot of the viceregal capital, the Chinese element does not seem out of place. Pierce, moreover, quotes from Thomas Gage, the English Dominican friar who, in the second decade of the 17th century, reported that, I quote, "the Indians and the people of China that have been made Christians and every year come hither have perfected the Spaniard in the craft of goldsmithery." The connection between Asia and the Americas appears to be unavoidable, and it's, in some cases, elusive. One of the most widespread objects of consumption in the Viceroyalty was the Japanese-inspired folding screen. Or Byobu. Japanese-European relations began in earnest in the 17th century, and the Jesuit missions that established colonies in the islands since the arrival of St. Francis Xavier in 1549, ushering what is usually called the Christian century. Between 1610 and 1614, a group of 19 Japanese traders arrived at the capital of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, headed by Tanaka Shonuko, a representative of the great Japanese trader Goto Shosaburu from Kyoto. The Viceroy sent his own carriage to bring Tanaka Shonuko to receive him with proper protocol, and the Japanese stayed in the convent next to the church of San Agustin, along with a judge and an interpreter. The arrival of the folding screen in New Spain may have been ushered in the taste of Japanese objects in the Viceroyalty during this particular time. The Italian Jesuit Scipione Anati published an account of the Japanese mission of 1614 to New Spain and Europe as told to him by members of Ambassador Hasekura to Nenaga. In it, he asserts the impact of these missions in both Europe and the New World. A most interesting narrative of the same activities can also be found in the diary of the Nahua writer Don Domingo de San Anton Muyon Chimalpain Kiahuatl Mamsin Chimalpain, as he is commonly known, who recorded events in the city of Mexico from 1589 to 1615. His writings are a rich source of information about the impact that the Japanese missions had in new Spanish territory. Chimalpain's numerous entries emphasize the importance of the wish of the visit in the context of the local history of Mexico City. New Spanish biombo production began as early as the first decades of the 17th century. They became indispensable items in the households of the elite, and as Gustavo Curiel has concluded, they generally occupied the upper part of the grand residence and opened onto the central front balcony, or the Salón de Estrado, or parlor. In view of the Viceroy's palace in Mexico City, the palace and the Alameda Park can be seen. Well-dressed passers-by with their servants parade on foot or in their horses. The use of clouds throughout the narrative is a remnant of the Japanese origin. In 1997, an exhibition of Chinese ceramics from colonial Mexico in the Los Angeles County Museum provided ample evidence of this very important import. According to George Kuwayama, the curator and editor of the catalog, the potters of Puebla had an opportunity to see and admire some of the ceramics from the Orient. Pueblan potters were so impressed by the Chinese imports that eventually in 1653, guild regulations exhorted its practitioners to emulate Chinese porcelains, and I quote, "In making these wares, the coloring should be in imitation of the Chinese ware, very blue, finished in the same style and with relief work in blue on this style of pottery where should be painted black dots with round colors." These links to the Far East were not limited to the mingling of migrants in the large new Spanish cities, to their contribution to colonial society, or to the goods, mostly luxury ones, but not solely, that were available to the colonial households. Many intellectuals observed affinities between the New World and Asia that went far beyond the superficial similarities of crafts, art forms, script, or such. The German Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher, for example, a contemporary of the Mexican intellectuals of Juan Inés de la Cruz and of Carlos de Sigüenza y Góngora, and with whom he corresponded actually, went so far as to link the pre-Hispanic past to Asian cultures by arguing that they had a common ancestry in Egypt. In fact, Kirchner's Oedipus Aegyptiacus and China Illustrata, which is the frontispiece, were works instrumental in closing the distance between these far-off continents and making connections with their past. This was not a new concept, as some of the first Franciscans friars to set foot in Mexico after the conquest associated the native populations of Mexico with the lost tribes of Israel. Enconchados, as well as biombos, silks, furniture, and other merchandise from Asia that comprised the main items of trade between Asia and the America, made their way in turn to the ports of Europe, creating for the first time a truly globalized economy of goods. When the work and travels of the missionaries, especially the Jesuits, who established a long-standing colonies in India, China, and Japan, are added to this equation, a more complex picture of the Renaissance and post-Renaissance world emerges, joining cultures hitherto unknown to each other. Hybridization then takes place on a more widespread scale than ever before. According to Octavio Paz, Baroque New Spain's art was unique precisely because he was able to weave all these strands successfully. Thank you very much.
Yes, our next speaker is Professor Laura Torres-Rodríguez, and she will talk about representations of Asia in contemporary Mexican literature. She is an assistant professor of Spanish at New York University. Thank you.
Before I begin, I would like to thank Araceli Tinajero, and the Builder Center for organizing this panel discussion and inviting me to participate. My presentation today is an outgrowth of a larger research project on the relationship between the intellectual tradition of Mexican Orientalism and the formation of nationalist ideology in Mexico between the 1900s and 1968. What I will present today is a development taking place outside this time framework of this project, and I will examine what has been going on with representations of Asia since 1968. While for earlier figures like Francisco Madero, José Vasconcelos, and Octavio Paz, Asia had been a positive model for national construction, in the years after the Tlatelolco massacre, a series of literary texts appear in which reference to Asia form a negative counterpoint that develops a language of state exception. Thus, today's presentation explores two views of Asian contemporary Mexican literature in the context of the loss of legitimacy of the state dominated by the institutional revolutionary party, known as the PRI, and the decadence of nationalism as a model of civic subjectivity. First, I will examine the mobilization of Orientalist stereotypes in the decade following 1968 to indirectly theorize the authoritarian nature of the state. Reflections on Maoist China and Soviet Russia provide a subtext for this section. Secondly, I will interrogate another significant trend in representations of Asian contemporary Mexican literature, very, very contemporary Mexican literature, the return in recent years to Japonism as a literary model of post-national subjectivity in the context of Mexican neoliberalism. I'm going to start with the first trend, post-68 state fictions. Perhaps one of the clearest examples of how Mexican representations of Asia began to change after 1968 can be seen in Octavio Paz Postdata, the 1969 sequel to El Laberinto de la Soledad. Although Asia, and above all India, has been for Paz a positive reference point for cultural construction, in 1968 it became a referential schema for Paz, for what Paz called the institution of state exception regimes in countries where capitalist development seemed to be impeded by archaic economic structures. Postdata popularized a genre of state fiction in which the Mexican state is associated with a series of classic stereotypes related to Oriental despotism, like pyramids, bureaucracy, statism, etc. It was not accidents that the point of comparison for Paz were the Soviet state and Imperial China. However, for this presentation, I want to privilege detective novels and thrillers in the creation of this type of state fictions, these imaginaries. No? Also in 1969, Rafael Bernal published one of the first Mexican crime novels, The Mongolian Conspiracy. In this book, reference to China's are filtered through the Orientalist tropes of the detective novel and film noir, like Lady of Shanghai, for example, Chinatown. The protagonist of the novel, Filiberto Garcia, a former revolutionary, is a paid hitman hired by the Mexican State's police force. The novel begins with an investigation in Mexico City's Chinatown to foil a supposed Maoist plot to assassinate the American president who is visiting Mexico. But the whole situation ends up being a baroque diversion orchestrated by the state itself to eliminate its own president. In other words, the Asian angle of the plot operates as a smokescreen, a twisted bureaucratic move that conceals how the state machinery declared its own exceptionality before the law, up to and including getting away with eliminating its own president. This explains why Elmer González used this book as a subtext for his 1999 novel, Un asesino solitario, which was inspired by the assassination of the presidential candidate Luis Donoso Colosio in 1994. The Mongolian Conspiracy is the Mexican state's conspiracy for an operation in which the adjective Mongolian will seem to hint at a despotic, twisted type of state machinery. Of course, this is a stereotype, no? The creation of oblique metaphors of the Mexican state as Asian also appears in the later detective novel Sho-shan, Morir en el Golfo by Héctor Aguilar Camín. In this thriller, the author also explored the corruption of the state-run oil industry, El Pemex, through a series of Orientalist tropes. For example, Aguilar Camín decides to name the biggest union agro-industrial commune La Mesopotamia, and he sets it up around a Mayan pyramid in Veracruz. In the novel, the Mesopotamia serves as a utopia of self-sufficient production whose condition of possibility will seem to be the corruption of the petrostate. Oddly, the Union Agro-Industrial Complex is linked to Maoist collectivism. In the book, Aguilar Camín calls an experiment in oil Maoism. Therefore, the text conflates the pre-Columbian pyramid, the classic symbol of Oriental despotism, with references to the Maoist state in a move previously used by Octavio Paz in Postdata. I want to end my analysis of this first tendency with a visual example from 2001. This is a photo of Daniela Rosell from his series Ricas y famosas. She took these portraits of her family and friends during the term of the last president of the PRI party, Ernesto Zedillo, and published them after the Mexican transition, the end of nearly a century of predomination. The collection as a whole has a number of distinctive characteristics. The women photographed posed openly inside their own homes, and the series deals with a social subject nearly captured in the history of Latin American photography, the oligarchic class, to which the photographer herself belongs. Controversy arose when Juan Villorro denounced the women's direct association with the PRI and connected esta apoteosis del mal gusto, or this apotheosis of bad taste, to the fortunes amassed during the 71 years of pre-control. For example, this is the granddaughter of Díaz Ordaz. No? This photo in particular interests me because it evokes, through decadentist aesthetics, a classic image of English Orientalist painting, the harem. The reception of the photo reenacts the interpretive gesture studied before. Public opinion reads the excess displayed in the visual overcodification as corruption, and the Orientalist pastiche expressly codifies it as state corruption. The harem served as a feminine reverse of Asian bureaucracy and the pyramid. Well, now I'm going to talk about the second trend, post-NAFTA Japonism. Daniela Rosel's photo evokes Orientalism through the tropes associated with the end of the century in Latin America. However, I would like to focus now on recent years to highlight the return of a movement linked to Mexican modernista literature, Japonism. Modernista Japonism, of the 19th century Japonism, developed in a context of economic liberalism in which the Porfirian state pursued diplomatic relations with the government of the Meiji Restoration to establish the trans-Pacific trade that had been interrupted by the Latin American wars of independence. In those years, Japan was proposed as an alternative to the European model for manufacturing and imports, the dream of a trans-Pacific modernity. Although it is anachronistic to equate the different situations at the turn of both centuries, it is productive to contextualize the proliferation of Japanese texts in contemporary literature with the increasing neoliberalization of the Mexican economy being carried out since the 1980s. Since then, the market has played a larger role in the configuration of the artistic panorama, generating other visions of Mexican citizenship than the ones officially promoted by the states through cultural institutions. In fact, the most recent official attempts at trans-Pacific globalization, the Pacific Alliance of 2011, and Mexico's negotiation to enter the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2006, have been characterized by an emphasis on the free market as an alternative continental model to economic protectionism of Mercosur, for example. Keeping this context in mind, I argue that Japanese literature thematized the relation between literary representation, global identities, and new media through two trends. First, Japanese culture appears as a mechanism for undoing Mexicanidad, to deregulate and globalize the parameters of cultural representation. Second, Japan is portrayed as a model for formal experimentation and technological innovation, while at the same time it is an example of high-profile hypermodernity drowned in traditional local designs of the type to which Mexico itself aspires. I would like to highlight two recent examples, Sho-shan y la Dama Oscura, written by F. Hill in 2009, and Forward Kyoto, written by Juan Villoro in 2010. Due to time constraints, I will not discuss other important examples, such as Biografía Ilustrada de Mishima, de Mario Bellatino, also published in 2009. Sho-shan y la Dama Oscura is the first Latin American novel narrated through Japanese manga and anime formats. F. Hill, the author, fits her writing style into specific rules of fiction for these globally popular visual genres. Her book attempts to fulfill the expectations of the most demanding manga fans. She seeks innovation in literary writing by emulating Japanese new media, a style that Jill calls, in a marketing ploy, realismo mágico, mágico realism, like realismo mágico. At the literary level, her project combines a range of popular genres such as teen literature, fantasy, and self-help, and it is proposed as a trilogy which has aroused in her audience the excited expectations reserved for serial novels. Sho-shan is furthermore closely associated with the cosplay subculture in Mexico. The novel has a website, fans of all ages, several playlists, and even a movie, and it has inspired different cosplay intervention among its fans. Here are some examples. Sho-shan is a singular example of how contemporary Mexican Japonism is linked to what could be called the global popular, or with the construction through new media of post-national cultural identities. It is interesting to note that Japan is presented in these photos as a model of alternative identification through an act of cultural transvestism as an exhibition platform for new subjectivities and collectives. The second example I would like to discuss is Forward Kyoto by Juan Villoro. As in Hill's novel, the Japanese referent functions as a literary stage from which to reflect on the advent of new technologies of visual representation. In the novel, the protagonist, an ex-photo developer who lost his job thanks to digital photography, moves to Kyoto to accompany his girlfriend, Naomi. Once in Japan, he begins to receive emails with a series of photos, each containing the subject line, Forward Kyoto. The book is a reflection on the process of dematerialization that digital technology imposes on the process of film developing, but also a reflection on new forms of consumption and circulation of non-digital photographs. Japan is the site chosen to express this affect linked to the displacement of one technology by another, and the contextualization understood as the effect of the circulation of people and things. And this is the sensation that the protagonist has in Kyoto. And I'm going to quote in Spanish, but you have the translation there, in case you need it. Japón es un país con password. Aquí todo tiene un código, había dicho Naomi. Serás feliz mientras no tengas el password. No llegué a Kioto para descodificar misterios, sino para alejarme de mi tierra, saturada de signos, casi todos agraviantes, donde la ofensa comenzaba por la manera de mirar. Japón me domaría, al menos mientras yo no tuviese el password. I want to emphasize three aspects of this quote. First, Japan appears encoded in the language of new media. Second, Japan represents an archive of affects associated with globalization, above all with the enjoyment of cultural alienation and defamiliarization. As Hector Hoyos has mentioned in a different context, the reference to Japan emphasized the local color of a known place, like those known places proliferated by neoliberalism. In this sense, the text will seem to be a novelistic version of Lost in Translation, or the Sofia Coppola movie. Third, Japan works to undo Mexico, no? To dissolve it or to dislocate it. This is clearly seen in the reading the narrator does of a photo of Araceli Turbide that he receives via email. This is the photo, but I'm going to read the quote again in Spanish. La siguiente imagen fue definitiva. El marco y el aura de la Virgen de Guadalupe, pero sin la Virgen. Los rayos de sol, la fe que irradia, estaban hechos con hojas de maguey. A los lados se veían otras plantas puntiagudas. Japón era un territorio sin púas ni filos evidentes. ¿Cuántas veces había sentido ese sol que no quemaba, tan diferente al ardor del cielo mexicano? El marco de la Virgen parecía un sistema de defensa, con como los pinchos de un puercoespín. Un altar sin deidad, un retablo afilado, mi país. In this quote, Japan appears as a point of contrast, a level territory in which to display the nation as an index of an absence, as a dislocated, empty frame, and obsolete defense system. Japan and Mexico are compared to theorize the space-time coordinates imposed by globalization and media, and I quote, a faraway home, the nearness in the distance. In conclusion, I have offered a general overview of two literary perspectives of Asia. Of course, the two tendencies presented do not cover all the cultural manifestations stemming from the current increasing interest in Asia. They are lines of readings designated to help navigate two distinct social contexts. First, I try to elucidate why literature at the end of the 60s returned to an imaginary associated with anachronistic Oriental despotism to construct a critical fiction of the predominated state. I'm interested in highlighting an Orientalism of the left, or a critical Orientalism, which paradoxically continued the old anti-Asia, above all anti-Chinese stereotypes. Second, I related more recent Mexican literature to Asian themes, in particular with a preference for Japan as an aesthetic model of trans-Pacific globalization, despite the growing importance of China in trans-Pacific commerce with Latin America. And my goal was to link literary representations to a specific historical context and imaginaries without necessarily reducing the later, no? And thanks.
Thank you. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Kathleen López. She is assistant professor in the Department of Latino and Hispanic Caribbean Studies and the Department of History at Rutgers University. She's the author of Chinese Cubans, A Transnational History. This book was published last year by the University of North Carolina Press. I think it's one of the best books that the scholar has produced in the last 20, 30 years that deals with the connections between China and Latin America. Is a precious book, and I thank you ever so much for fantastic book. You almost made me cry. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so her talk today, let me go back to her talk. Her talk today is about Chinese-Mexican relations in historical perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here on a Friday afternoon. Many thanks to Araceli Tinajero and for bringing us together and to the Bildner Center. I've been in New York for about 15 years now, and the Bildner Center has been a constant source of support. So one of my very first papers I presented here actually dealt with Chinese economic and diplomatic ties with Cuba, and that evolved into a chapter and eventually became the epilogue of my book. But I always had that interest in what is this impact of the increasing presence of China diplomatically and economically across Latin America. What would be the impact on Chinese migrants actually living in these countries? Since I have spent the past over 10 years studying Cuba, I'm not a Mexico expert, but today I'll just make an attempt to answer some of these questions and to historicize the contemporary China-Mexico relationship. So I'll begin with a small anecdote. Around 2010, I think it was, a couple of years after the Olympics in Beijing, I was in a village in Guangdong province, and it was a tiny village. A couple of tourists would pass through to see some of the architecture, and I picked up for my son, who was just 2 years old at the time, a small toy, and I paid 50 cents US for it. And some of you may have seen it. It's a round, like, paddle, and there's a rooster on it, and so when you turn it, the rooster pecks. Okay. And I was all proud that I found this for him, and I brought it back along with some old Olympic stuff that they had, clackers, that they hadn't sold during the Olympics. Bring it home. And that was in September, and then that Christmas we get together for the families, and my brother brought a gift for my son also. And he was so proud. He said, we were in Mexico in the countryside and bought this beautiful handcrafted toy for Bobby, and we only paid $5 for it, US. And it was the same exact toy. They clearly were made in the same factory. So it really attests to this kind of relationship between China and Cuba. I will take a picture of it the next time I do this.
Yeah.
And so what I'll do today, I'll do a couple of things, but first, the anecdote just illustrates, kind of this trade imbalance between China and Mexico, the intense investment or the desire for investment on Mexico's part, and the building economic ties. It really is an example of globalization. So today I'll give a little bit of the historical background to China-Mexico relations, and especially Chinese immigration to Mexico. And then discuss the situation today and the potential for a kind of backlash against Chinese who are living in Mexico, whether permanently or temporarily. And then finally, I want to just discuss the state of the field, the research that's being done on China-Mexico relations, and what I think needs to be done still. So first, to begin with the history. The history already, or the first presenter had discussed some of that early history of Asia-Mexico exchange, especially those first Asian migrants in the area. but that the first major migrations of Chinese to Mexico came in the late 19th century. So just as the time that Chinese were going across the Americas, were being imported as laborers to help work on plantations, work in railroads, and help build up these export economies. So it's really, another major event was the U.S. Exclusion Act of 1882. So Mexico didn't rely as much on massive amounts of Chinese laborers as places like Peru and Cuba did. But when the U.S. permanently excluded Chinese laborers, actually it was first just for a 10-year period, and then it sort of got renewed every so often. So it was an exclusion of Chinese laborers. Many of them were diverted southward. And so that northern part of Mexico, and some of them came south just to kind of try to re-enter as an illegal Mexican migrant. So some of them came under the rule of Porfirio Diaz. This was that first kind of major migration of Chinese to Mexico, but most of them came through the U.S. They tended to monopolize grocery and dry goods trade. So there were laborers, but they also quickly established small shops and were in this kind of transnational trade between the U.S. and Mexico. As I do have a slide here of the population. So it shows kind of the gradual growth of Chinese in Mexico. Again, most of them concentrated in the northern part of Mexico. And by the early decades, like by 1926, it reaches almost 25,000. And so this was the largest population of foreigners in Mexico. And the first, the second largest, sorry, the largest were the Spanish. So it was quite significant. Although the numbers are, again, much lower than a place like Peru or Cuba, the impact was much greater because they were really concentrated regionally in northern Mexico. So at the time, those of you who are familiar with Mexican history, the early 20th century was a time of anti-foreignism and an emerging nationalism in the context of the Mexican Revolution of 1910, so just before and after it. And so the concentration of Chinese in these northern regions made these settlements conducive to anti-Chinese attitudes and policies. And these were specifically directed against Chinese as opposed to other foreigners. In one very bloody incident in 1911, bands of soldiers with Francisco Madero attacked Chinese in the town of Torreon, and it resulted in 303 deaths and extensive property damage. And this was really one of the bloodiest anti-Chinese incidents in all of the Americas. There's been a lot of scholarship recently among the English language. There always has been a tradition of Mexican researchers working on this, but now there's at least 3 or 4 books in the English language. And so the most basic general history is Robert Chow Romero, who wrote a book just called The Chinese in Mexico. He covers this incident. So there were anti-foreign attacks during the first half of the century, and also other kinds of incidents such as boycotts against Chinese products and discriminatory legislation. So how can we explain all this, especially the kinds of incidences of extreme violence? One answer is just to look at this the imbalance and the perceived advantages that Chinese merchants had and the resentment it caused locals. But beyond that, during this time, late 19th, early 20th century, all of Latin America, floating around Latin America, were these theories of scientific racism. And this is when it underpinned these ideological arguments for the elimination of non-whites from the national body. So in places like Cuba, it would be directed more toward the Afro population, and in places like Mexico, especially northern Mexico, it's directed toward Arabs and Chinese. Eventually, and there was also a big push for immigration from Spain, so considered white immigrants across Latin America. Eventually, especially given the large populations of indigenous people across Mexico and other parts of Latin America, the theory and concept of mestizaje or racial and cultural mixing as the foundation for new nations began to highlight the potential of the native population. So in other words, there were attempts to, in places like Cuba, to bring the Afro population within this new nation being created, and in Mexico to bring the indigenous population in. And there simply was no place for the Chinese in these discourses. So in places in Sonora in northern Mexico, local political candidates would actually use this anti-Chinese platform to build up popular support. And it was always grounded in pro-Mexico ideas, such as businesses and sanitation, supporting local businesses, improving sanitation, which Chinese were blamed for anti-sanitary habits. There was also a ban on intermarriage and residential segregation, taxes directed specifically against Chinese businesses, demands for Chinese to hire more Mexican workers, and even a requirement that they take public baths. So these were all actually on the books in these in some towns in northern Mexico. The other things you start to see, some of the tracts that were circulated. So this is a translation from one of these books that went around in 1930s. You can actually get the book, the original Spanish, in local libraries here. The translation is, the yellow race, especially the Chinese race, is so distant from the Indo-Latin civilization and customs in religion and political and moral ideas that the Chinese seem to us like beings from another world. So it's this kind of really distancing the Chinese from any potential place that they could have in the Mexican nation. And this is right on the cusp of when they were, the Chinese were expelled or deported from northern Mexico. This is a little bit earlier, but this is right around the beginning of the Mexican Revolution, The Exile of the Chinese, an anonymous poem that floated around. And you find these kinds of lyrics in songs, the corridos, but also in poetry, and just kind of common refrains that were repeated and passed down. And it has, this kind of language of, what we hear today, basically, with immigration. They'll take away our job, they'll swamp our nations, don't let them overrun us. And this is just a part, but you'll notice at the very end, let's make sure that those wretched Chinese don't breed in our nation. So that became another major concern, is the miscegenation or racial mixing. And you started to see some vile caricatures. So this one's been published a lot in some of both the Mexican scholarship and recent U.S. scholarship. And what this depicts is, there were a whole series of them, and published in the 1930s and circulated around Mexico. And it's sort of a warning to the Mexican woman. So this ostensibly is supposed to help protect the Mexican woman against the Chinese. So it takes place in China. It's a Chinese man who has married a Mexican woman, taken her back to China, and you can see he has more than one woman. He's treating them like slaves. They're doing all the work. It's these kind of vile caricatures of them. And it says, the caption below can be translated as, if it's insanity or ignorance that makes you become a wife, is it prostitute or mistress, right? Of a Chinese, then, and this is what you want to bring to your nation. Before you decide to do it, you take a knife and dip it in venom and stick it into your heart. So in other words, save yourself from this kind of misery. Indeed, there are stories when the Mexicans, finally in 1931, there was one of these nationalization of labor laws. Any business had to have 80% of its people native-born, Mexican-born, or citizens. And so this is when, it was sort of the pretense for deporting the Chinese from northern Mexico. Many of them were indeed married to Mexican women. They brought them with them back to China, especially the port cities of Macau and Hong Kong. And in some cases, quite a few hundred cases actually, the men eventually left their wives and went back to their families in Guangdong province or Fujian province, wherever they were from. And so you had sort of bands of Mexican women left in places like Macau and Hong Kong. And there's a wonderful book that really deals in depth with that phenomenon called Chinese Mexicans. It's also University of North Carolina Press. And the author is Julia Maria Schiavone Camacho. So that really deals with that one piece of the story. So, it's not that it's completely fabricated, but of course the image as it's circulated is exaggerated. The Mexican women themselves ultimately appealed to the Mexican government, and eventually by the late 30s and early 40s were able to return home, most of them. So they had, altogether, there were 215 anti-Chinese organizations that existed throughout Mexico by 1932. And Evelyn Hudehart says, she's done a lot of writing on this topic, but she says, the difference was that the leaders changed the mode of engagement with the Chinese from physical attacks on their properties and persons to a political campaign using the law and political pressure to force them out of Mexico, in effect resorting to a different kind of violence. So it was violence, but it was organized and it was condoned by the Mexican government. As far as supporters, there were very few supporters of the Chinese in Mexico, except for who were non-Chinese. But there were the people who actually wanted to hire them. So these tended to be large business owners and sometimes European and American business owners. And so as far as the lower middle classes and leaders of the anti-Chinese movement, they also were criticizing these, they called them chineros, kind of Chinese lovers, as enemies of the Mexican nationalist cause. So the situation changed across the board after the 1940s. The situation did change for the Chinese in Latin America and the Caribbean. China, mostly because during World War II, Japan invades China, and so there's a lot of sympathy for Chinese immigrants, and they're able to use this to, through their ethnic associations, to educate people about what's happening in China, and just try to present themselves as law-abiding citizens who are fighting on the Allied side in World War II, and that should be supported in the various host countries. So China, as many of you know, underwent a communist revolution in 1949, and so after that, shortly after, Mexico, along with most other countries in the Western Hemisphere, maintained diplomatic ties with Taiwan and not with China. But Mexico was one of the early people who are governments who switched allegiances. So by 1972, they had switched their allegiance back to the People's Republic of China or mainland China. And although Taiwan still engages in trade with Mexico. So the situation as far as the China-Mexico relations was shaky throughout the 1970s and 80s, much as it has been with the rest of the Western Hemisphere. And there actually were these moments of political difference. For example, when the Dalai Lama was invited to come to Mexico, and that created a lot of opposition among the People's Republic of China government. Today, along with this boom in China-Mexico relations and China-Latin America engagement, historians are commenting on it, policymakers are commenting on it, government officials, but it's mostly the economists and the political scientists who are kind of constantly monitoring. You can find a different article every week dealing with some aspect of this in China-Mexico relations. And one of the leading commentators, Evan Ellis, says that the most important differences among the states of Latin America and the Caribbean today with regard to China are about economics, not politics. So the political piece has kind of withered away. So occasionally it comes up. China itself has said, we don't care who we trade with about ideologically, we just want to trade. Another comment that these economists and political scientists are making is that there's no coherent policy. So it's very clear that there's a trade imbalance. And the problem is the sense is that China is dumping their manufactured goods on Mexico, so kind of harming handicraft or native industries, and that they're not investing enough. So the Latin American countries do want Chinese investment. Some of them, especially ones who are not in a good relationship with the U.S., want this relationship to be sort of a buffer against U.S. imperialism. And so there's certainly, almost everyone, especially the policymakers in Mexico, see the need to have a more coherent policy. And Enrique Dussel, who's one of the leaders of this research, says there's no strategy that adequately reflects China's global importance and does justice to our second leading trade partner. We seem to have hit an all-time low. I don't think economic and trade relations can get any worse. So I'll give you just two examples. I'll show a few images. This is the Barrio Chino in Mexico City. Kind of a typical supermarket. An archway, which was built by the Chinese government, the People's Republic of China, kind of just to celebrate and commemorate the Chinese presence in Mexico. And this you'll find all over Latin America and the Caribbean. If you go to the Dominican Republic's Barrio Chino, there are two archways, one built by Taiwan, one built by the People's Republic of China. And then this is one of the examples I'll talk about. So the Paracho guitar. Does anyone here play guitar? Do you know this? The Paracho guitar it's a wooden guitar, handmade, hand-strung, and it's supposedly one of the best in the world. It's known worldwide for its quality. The actual town that it's made in, up to 40% of the population are sustained by the production of this guitar. And that amounts to hundreds of families who are, either involved in some way in making it or depend because their parents work in the industry as far as the children. And since the Chinese presence has increased in Mexico over the past decade or so, production of these guitars has gone down 30%. And the locals are attributing it to cheap Chinese copies that are being produced and sold on the market. And there's the rise of defense groups, as they call them in Mexico, and they're organizing as of now not directly as an anti-Chinese group, but just as a defense of artisanry and the local community and Mexican-made products. But given what we know about that early history of anti-Chinese violence in northern Mexico, I think it could evolve into something more, especially as this populist politics begins to grow. Similar examples are with the cheap Chinese toys that you see everywhere, the plastics that have lights, flashing lights in them. And you see all kinds of discourse. You see it mostly in Mexican newspapers and on the internet, on even blogs. So for example, parents writing about how, why don't their kids use the wooden toys anymore? Why is everything electronic? So it's not so dissimilar from what we see here. And then as you also see this sort of backlash against Chinese or questioning about the degree of Chinese investment and or trade and the imbalance. But you also see something else happening, which is a little bit different, and that's a simultaneous promotion of learning about China, Chinese history, Chinese society, and especially Chinese language. And so the investment in places like Mexico and elsewhere in Latin America in learning the Chinese language hasn't been nearly matched by the United States, even though it was offered here much earlier. So it's just over the past decade. Lots of media articles and media attention on this need for everyone to learn Chinese language. And so the last thing I want to do is talk about some of the research initiatives. So briefly, the study of China-Mexico relations has been dominated by two sort of distinct areas. And one, as I mentioned, is the policy, economics, political scientist approaches. Very interested in strategic relations between Latin America and China, Mexico and China, but also the U.S. role in all of that. Should the U.S., does the U.S. need to get involved more? Does the U.S. need to be defensive? And so you have all kinds of U.S. think tanks getting involved in that, especially the Inter-American Dialogue, which is third down. They have a special China and Latin America program on their website, which is just filled with articles and information. So that's a good first stop to go for this. More recently, the University of Miami Center for Latin American Studies has an Asia and Latin America in the 21st Century program. They have a new newsletter that just came out. The first one came out last week called Guanxi, which means relations. It's the Chinese word for relations. So reciprocity between two places. And these are kind of more, Inter-American Dialogue and University of Miami are more real think tanks. They're just kind of producing reports and producing knowledge about this. But both of them have a distinctly contemporary kind of emphasis and very little on the actual historical precedents. So two other kinds of initiatives that are trying to, I think, address this. The last one is the LASA, Latin American Studies Association section for Asia and the Americas, which I know Araceli has been a long-time member, and so has seen the changes in it.
Yes.
And it's been over the last couple of years that we've tried to bring in people that do cultural studies, works like literature, art, visual representation, and also, more importantly, I think, try to put us in dialogue with each other. So I certainly represent the historical, cultural side. I think all of us do. And it's sometimes tricky. We'll go to a panel on the economics and the investment, and I don't know what they're talking about, literally. The charts after charts. But I think there really is this potential for us to be more in dialogue with each other, and certainly an interest. I've noticed an increasing interest for the very people that are writing these reports wanting to know, well, what's happening on the ground with actual migrants? Because they're not out there necessarily doing interviews with new Chinese migrants, with with business owners, and there's some exceptions. As far as research done in Mexico itself, the first organization, the Sechimex, it's at the university in Mexico, and this one has it's basically a university, so you're going to get all kinds of projects coming out of that. And then related to that, this network for Latin America and China, Latin America, Caribbean, and China, this academic network. It's now going on, I think we're on the second international seminar. And so what's really great about this, it's an international congress, but very few people from the U.S. have actually been going to it. I think more people need to go. All of the papers and panels are in Spanish. And I was surprised, it usually happens in May of every year, but I was surprised that the number of presentations at the last one in 2012 were up to 26 out of a total of 108. So that's about 25% that dealt with history, culture, and Chinese language learning. And I noticed most of them actually dealt with this issue of Chinese language learning. Some of the other things were kind of cultural approaches to China. If you want to do business, you should know about Chinese cultural approaches. Stuff that we were doing in the U.S. 30, 40 years ago, but never, we never really made it a primary emphasis in our curriculums. So I think this is significant, and I think this is another good place to go, or at least, if we can't physically be there, to look at the papers. A lot of them are posted online. They post small publications like the Bildner Center does. And so I think that's my last slide. Yeah, I just wanted to, end on that note that I think that there is a real potential to fuse the kind of literary historical research on China, Mexico, along with the contemporary stuff. And especially, I think there's an importance to sort of ensure that something like Torreon doesn't happen again, with the anti-foreign backlash. Thank you.